It's a pleasure to be with you. I also enjoy small crowds. It's a little bit more intimate, so good to have you all here. Maybe let me start by talking about the name of the talk. I think when many people hear Overthrowing Eco-Apartheid, they'll hear the eco part and they'll think we're talking just about ecology, right, or environment. And the name of the talk is based on a book that I'm writing, and the eco is not meant to be just the ecological, right? When we think about the word eco, it actually comes from a Greek term called oikos. I don't know if I'm saying that right, I don't know Greek. That term oikos means home, our household, right? And that's the root for both ecology and for economy, right? Because the economics is the study of our common home, our community, our society. And similarly, ecology is our common home, the place we live in nature. And I chose that specifically because I think one of the biggest pieces of propaganda that has been perpetuated on us by capitalists, by corporations, and by colonizers is that we can separate those two types of eco, the ecology and the economy. And they really are both intricately connected to our common home, the ecological and the economic. And we have a form of apartheid around both of them that we need to overthrow, right? And that mission of overthrowing that false dichotomy is partly a decolonial mission. Here I want to turn to the work of a scholar at UKZN, University of KwaZulu-Natal, Dr Alex. And he wrote a really interesting paper, and he was looking into the histories of Ubuntu. And I think we're all relatively familiar. Ubuntu is very much about our personhood, is through our relationship to other people, to our community, right? And what Joan Gotze was saying in his paper is that if you actually look historically to conceptions of Ubuntu, that personhood, that community was not just the human community, it was also the ecological community, it was nature too, that was embedded in our conceptions of personhood in Southern Africa, right? Of course, not necessarily my historical conceptions of personhood given the shade of my skin. If you're wondering where my family is from, that's from Mauritius, and we have different histories there. But in terms of the South African sense of Ubuntu, it's very much connected into the ecological community as well as the human community, right? And the colonial project was to separate us not only from our relationships to our community, to force people into economic dependence on things like migrant labor, but also to separate us from the natural world, from the land. And both of these things, both our human community and our ecological community, is what sustained, what is able to sustain communities to be able to be independent, right? And so the colonial project was breaking down both of those relationships in order to make communities not independent anymore and force them into relationships of subjugation under capitalism, right? And that's what Marx calls this metabolic rift. Is that idea is that it removes us from those relationships that can sustain our communities. And so if we want to upend colonialism, we've also got to upend that false divide between ecology and economy and recognize that they're deeply interconnected, right? And under apartheid, of course, the exploitation of our common home, our eco, was taken to pretty incredible heights. And it took us to a point where we are not only the most unequal society in the world, to have one of the highest levels of unemployment, and I think we don't recognize often enough that South Africa is in fact one of the most polluting countries in the world, right? And these things aren't accidents that they all come together. They're all based on the fact that we built a country on one of the most exploitative and rapacious economic systems in the world, right? And to give you a sense of just how bad of a polluter we are, so South Africa is the 12th biggest climate polluter in the world, if you look at it at absolute terms. If you try and measure it at units, per capita unit of GDP, so for every unit of GDP you create, how much pollution you make, South South Africa is in fact one of the worst in the world. We're worse than China, and we rank behind only a few countries that are incredibly polluting. So they are Turkmenistan, Palau, and Mongolia. So they're incredibly polluting. And so contrary to the spin of our Minister of Pollution and Climate Destruction, Gwede Mantashe, our energy sector is in fact the most polluting of all G20 nations, right? So it's pretty astounding. I shouldn't joke too much about Gwede because he's sent his lawyers on me and threatened to sue me for my writing and for activism, but you know, that's Gwede. He's very litigious and he doesn't like to be critiqued in public. And it's not a mistake that we are we are three, highest inequality, most polluting, and highest unemployment. It's because we've built an economy that drives that, right? We have an economy that's driven by the minerals energy complex, right? And it has dominated our economy, it's dominated our politics, and this distorted growth path has locked us into low employment, very high pollution, capital intensive economy, right? It's based on cheap labor, the exploitation of people. It's based on cheap nature, the exploitation of the environment. And it's very much based on the exploitation of women too, not valuing the social reproductive work that they do, which is at the heart of the migrant labor system so much in South Africa, right? And what we see is that these large mineral energy complex firms have dominated South Africa's political economy for centuries, right? And they've used their massive power to keep us locked into this very extractive form of economic growth, which extracts from humans, which extracts from nature, and which does incredible damage, right? And if you want proof that we're still dominated by them, I don't know how many of you saw the news that the planetarium over at WITS is now going to be called let me get this right, the WITS Anglo-American Digital Dome. They're sponsoring the dome there, the old planetarium, right? And of course, before then was the WITS Sibanye Stillwater Infinity Bridge, which is pretty, just on the nose, like, wow. That Sibanye Stillwater feels like that they can buy that social license. I'm grateful for the likes of the socialist youth movement over at WITS that have been protesting this unholy alliance between extractive capitalism and WITS, but that tells you, like, some of our most important public institutions are so tied into that minerals energy complex still, right? And so if this is the heart of our economic system, if we want to create growth, and if we want to create growth that supports employment, growth that supports greater equality, and growth that supports more ecologically sound modes of development, it makes little sense to just be stoking the capital investments in that very unequal rapacious system. But that's very much what our president's doing. It's very much what the ANC is doing. I believe our President Ramaphosa is currently over in the United Kingdom, and he's been very gracious towards his hosts there. I think one of the things he was talking about was how the United Kingdom joined hands with South Africa in helping to end apartheid 30 years ago. Was one of those wonderful quotes. And I think he's over there to placate the capital that is extracting wealth from South Africa right now. It's partly because he's at the top of it. We have a billionaire president who benefits from some of the most brutal mining, extractive industries that destroy both the environment and are reliant on the brutal repression, extraction of wealth from labor, right? And so, we've got a trickle-down economy that trickles down not much by way of economic prosperity, but certainly a lot in terms of pollution, certainly a lot in terms of violence. Those are the things that really trickle down to us, right? Or particularly to the more marginalized. I think there are those of us that manage to get significant benefits from that, but I think the vast majority of the black poor in South Africa, you see more of the harms trickling down than the benefits. And we've been warned about this state of affairs, whether it's Kwame Nkrumah telling us that neo-colonialism is the worst form of imperialism because it's not that the UK is here still extracting wealth, but they get to still have their corporations pulling out wealth without any of the responsibility of actually having to govern. and I think assassinated academic Walter Rodney said a similar thing. It was like, you will replace colonialism with the worst of corporate extractivism. And in the South African context, of course, Biko is maybe the best person who warns us about this. And he says that the whites have locked up within a small minority of themselves the greater proportion of the country's wealth. We have a mere change of face of those in governing positions. What is likely to happen is that black people will continue to be poor. You'll see a few blacks filtering through into the so-called bourgeoisie. Our society will be run almost as of yesterday. So for meaningful change to appear, there needs to be an attempt at reorganizing the whole economic pattern and economic policies within this particular country. I think it's pretty clear when it comes to both the economic extractivism as well as the ecological extractivism that this is very much the case. And to draw on another point that Biko made, Biko did this really interesting critique of some of the black churches back in the day. And he said one of the problems that the black churches, some of the black, not all of them, there's more radical liberation black churches, but some of them, he was saying their problem was is that they individualized problems. So if you were facing poverty, the problem was not the structural systems, it was your sin, it was you that was the problem, right? And this individualization of sin as if the reason why you are wretched is because of your wretchedness, not because you're living under the most extractive system ever designed by man, right? And I think that's the case both when it comes to the structures of inequality that we've created, but it's also interesting the case when it comes to questions of pollution. So you might know that have you folks ever heard of the concept of carbon footprint? It's to measure how much your individual lifestyle creates greenhouse gas emissions and contributes to climate change, right? You might not know that the corporation that most popularized that notion is British Petroleum, or Beyond Petroleum as they like to call themselves now. And it was a way to shift blame for the climate crisis and for the ecological crisis onto you as the individual. And so they popularized it. They had propaganda campaigns to be like, let's talk about your carbon footprint. Let's not talk about BP's massive infrastructure of extraction and the way that BP corrupts governments in order to prevent them from taking action. And so I think both when it comes to, in South Africa, blaming people for their own poverty and blaming them for, blame across the world for contributing to climate change, we have this problematic individualism. And I think an important task is to flip that on its head, right? And I want to use the example of energy in South Africa to maybe also demonstrate that a little bit more clearly. I think many of you, when you listen to the media and you hear about our energy crisis, there's often this refrain of Soweto needs to pay their electricity bills, right? There's this unpaid electricity bills from the poor, like this is the crisis of non-payment. It's such rubbish. We're blaming the victims of the problem for the problem, right? And partly you can see that because, I don't know how many of you know that when people in Soweto pay their prepaid meters, right? There's actually a charge that comes where they need to pay extra in order to pay back the municipal non-payment. So they are actually paying for this, right? On one hand. And what isn't being paid, there was a study done by the Public Affairs Research Institute which shows that the governments, the municipal governments, are taking money that's supposed to be delivered to free basic electricity and misappropriating those funds, right? And so you have a real crisis of non-payment because those that deserve free basic electricity aren't getting paid. And then they're being forced to pay prepaid electricity and then are being forced to pay the non-payments as part of that, right? So it's really quite incredible. And I think if we measure the non-payments of municipalities versus broader corruption, we'll see who the true culprits are. So you can measure the non-payment of all municipalities across South Africa, and my figures might be a little bit outdated, but it was about 60 billion rand. It's a lot of money. But we need to compare it to other questions. So Medupi and Kusile were two of the latest mega coal power projects that were commissioned under the ANC. Now they were initially supposed to cost us about 60 billion rand, both of them. They ballooned to about 500 billion rand, right? So just that overcost run of those particular two coal power plants was nearly 10 times the amount of municipal non-payment, right? So the fact that we're blaming the poor for that is crazy. And so we can take that 500 billion, but then we can also look, there was a special investigative unit report done around the first load shedding crisis we had in 2008. And this report was released to the Zuma administration, and they squashed it, they never released this one. But in this report, it showed that during that first 2008 load shedding crisis, it was partly engineered because there were people that were going and helping to like ensure that there were low coal stocks. And when that happened, they signed on board 14 trillion rands worth of overpriced coal contracts. That's a staggering amount of money, right? And so the non-payment is arguably a symptom of that corruption rather than the cause of it, right? And I think this brings me to a Malcolm X quote. So if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing, right? And I think that's very much the case when it comes to how the ANC and people like Wede Montashe are trying to tell us that the coal industry is our saviors, right? Like we must support coal. But meanwhile, it's those very coal companies that are the ones that are extracting an incredible amount of wealth. You know, post-apartheid, the thing we were supposed to do was to tax the wealthy and to redistribute wealth to the poor, right? That's what we should have done. We were the most unequal society, we still are. And instead, what we've seen through these corrupt coal contracts and through Eskom is probably the biggest reverse distribution of wealth, where we've taken money from the poor and given it to corrupt coal companies, right? And so, and it was crazy because Medupi and Kusile were also built back in 2010. There was massive civil society opposition to this, not only because we knew that they'd be very expensive, there would be cost overruns, but we were in the middle of the climate crisis. And the science was quite clear that we needed to be moving away from fossil fuels. But in partnership with the very corrupt the ANC, they had investments in Haitashi, which helped build the boilers for Medupi and Kusile. So they were one of the biggest beneficiaries, and the World Bank approved that loan despite the fact that there was very clear corruption around it. And so we are locked now as citizens into paying those corrupt loans. And even though there has been charges at the New York Stock Exchange against Haitashi because of corruption, we still have to pay those loans, right? And so that's this transfer of wealth not only to the corrupt coal companies, but also to the World Bank, right? And so there's this very clear extraction of wealth going on. And it's kind of funny because I think some of you might know that we just came out of this UN climate summit in Egypt. And one of the things that South Africa signed on to was a bunch of loans to help us transition to renewable energy, right? Some of them with the World Bank, right? But we're still paying loans to the World Bank for these damn corrupt coal plants. And then we're going to pay more loans to the World Bank for renewable energy. And if we'd invested that 14 trillion rand or the 500 billion rand that went to Medupi and Kusile, I mean, you can see now we're plunged into load shedding because they were badly constructed. Imagine instead of that path we had invested in renewables, but instead we're now getting locked into more debt. This brings me to a point about something called, there's a British journalist called George Monbiot, and he's called something called the pollution paradox. And it's the more destructive a corporation is, the more polluting is, the more they harm people, the more they have to corrupt governments in order to stay in power, right? Because if there's a corporation that's socially beneficial, we buy into it because we appreciate it. But if these corporations are very extractive, if they are very harmful, then they have to buy power in order to create social license. So that's why you see our friends over there with Sibanye Stillwater Bridge and so on, right? Because we live in the heart of a captured government because these harmful corporations that extract so much have to buy power. And I think we need to be careful because we're being Bell Pottingered again when it comes to energy. I really think we are. Because there's this claim that the coal, oil, and gas corporations are somehow these saviors that are fighting against this Western clean energy agenda that Minister Mantashe and certain individuals are spinning, right? They're trying to claim that, the agenda to bring clean energy to South Africa is really about trying to rob us of our rich mineral wealth of coal, oil, and gas. But we've seen that extractivism has made us very unequal, quite poor, and it hasn't really delivered meaningful benefits, right? Now, maybe just want to reflect a little bit on the Shell case to demonstrate that a little bit. So many of you know Shell wanted to do offshore seismic surveys to see whether they could extract oil and gas from off the wild coast, right? And Minister Mantashe was quite incredible in that. He came out and he said that those resisting Shell are guilty of apartheid and colonialism of a special kind, right? It was truly incredible because if you analyze the people on each side of this, it's very much the flip side of this. So on one hand we have Shell, formerly known as Royal Dutch Shell, a very significant European multinational guilty of creating devastation across the African continent. If you go to the Niger Delta, you see that what they've left behind there is a toxic legacy of desperation, poverty, poisoned water and air, right? And violence as well, pure violence. And similarly Mozambique, where they've done, Total has explored there, studies show that hasn't delivered development, it's delivered increased poverty and increased inequality and some of the most significant political instability and violence that Mozambique has seen, right? And so there's this claim that these are our decolonial liberators. It's Total and Shell, right? But I think there's one player in that Shell case that isn't often fingered. It's a company that calls themselves Impact Africa, right? And Impact Africa, despite their name that they're African, is it's owned, the CEO is a guy called Johnny Copland, a white South African, who has a UK-based firm. That is, if you go online, look at their board, it's just white men from the UK. And they are the ones that are going to be extracting off the wild coast. Then you compare that to those that are fighting the actual struggle, right? So I was fortunate enough, I got to walk along the wild coast with one of the people that is the lead applicants against this. It's someone called Zinikugu Sipu. And he's part of Sustaining the Wild Coast. He also often partners with, I think people will know this more, Amadiba Crisis Committee, also one of the lead applicants, right? And when you walk with someone like Zinikugu and he tells you about what their struggle is about, it's very much a decolonial struggle. It's about how do we sustain our traditional livelihoods? How do we ensure that our oceans are not destroyed in the name of a corporation that's just going to extract more wealth to European shareholders, right? And it's very clear. It's like, and the Amadiba Crisis Committee has this wonderful quote, and when they won against Mantashe in the court, they said that Mantashe's department is the doormat that multinational corporations use to wipe their feet on before they continue their colonial looting. I might have misquoted that, but it's one of my favorite quotes, because really this is, it's a decolonial struggle against some of the most rapacious corporations. And then Minister Mantashe has the audacity to say that those opposing it are guilty of colonialism and apartheid of a special kind. And what's, I think, particularly just incredibly frustrating about that is there is this history in South Africa of white environmentalism where indigenous communities are displaced from their land. If you think about how places like the Kruger National Park were built and many other Republican national parks, it was through violent dispossession so that white people could have access to what they call pristine nature without the inconvenience of black people there, right? And so he taps into this ugly history of white environmentalism and tries to use it against the very people trying to fight for decolonization, right? And to fight against multinational corporations. And so I think we need to be very careful and see through this spin that's being put in this propaganda. But I think there is a relevant critique to be made that there are Western interests that are trying to really benefit from South Africa's renewable energy resources. And we can't lose that at the same time. You know, when South Africa goes and signs billions of new loans at those UN climate summits, the World Bank isn't giving this to us because they care about us. Right? I think we're pretty naive if we think that. Neither is Germany, the US, or the UK. These are still very much colonial powers, and what they're trying to sign onto with their deals is the ability for their corporations to be the ones that benefit the most from renewable energy in South Africa. As opposed to what could be the case is if South Africa invested in what's called the green industrialization, where we are the ones who build and manufacture renewable energy rather than importing it from elsewhere, then we could create millions of new jobs in South Africa. And similarly, if rather than privatizing Eskom so that all the generation is owned predominantly by European corporations, as well as Patrice Motsepe, who is the brother-in-law of our president, where the profits are siphoned off to a few. I mean, renewable energy used to be very expensive, right? In the past 10 years, the prices have come down absolutely incredibly. It is now our cheapest form of energy, right? Yeah, by a long way. It beats our coal, beats our gas. But who should benefit from that, right? Who should benefit from those costs coming down? Should it be private multinational corporations coming into South Africa, taking all the profits, and then we as the citizens who have to buy through Eskom basically are paying for those profits that go to them? Or should it be us as the people of South Africa harnessing our own wind and our own sunshine to reap those benefits in the form of lower energy costs in terms of earning our energy? And I think what we've seen under the president is a very wide-scale privatization, as well as trying to use load shedding as an excuse to force in some more incredibly corrupt projects. Has anybody here heard of power ships? It should be a national scandal. So, some of you might know Esma Gashule got an honorary doctorate in Turkey a little while back. So that should raise some red flags already. Now, there is a Turkish company called Car Power Ship, and they want to bring in these big ships that have these gas turbines on them, right, as a solution to load shedding. Now, they've somehow got the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy to agree to sign a 20-year contract with these power ships. Now, normally these ships only come in when a country has been through been through war, civil war, or there's been a natural disaster, and so they bring it in for like maybe 2 years, 3 years max, because they're so damn expensive to run, and they're so polluting, right? Minister Mantashe is offering them this 20-year contract to come into South Africa, and it's going to cost us over 200 billion rand. And that was even before the Ukraine-Russia war, where gas prices went through the roof. So I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up costing us, like Udupi and Kusile did, closer to 500 billion rand, right? And so this is what they're trying to push through. When load shedding crisis was happening, they created an emergency power procurement program in order to push those programs through. And we as civil society have been fighting against it because we don't want to be locked into this crazy corrupt projects, right? So yeah, it's pretty astounding. And I lost my point on power ships because it gets me angry. But so the point was that we should be instead investing in our own green industrialization, in building renewables at home. But instead they're using the crisis of load shedding, they are prolonging the crisis of load shedding so that they can lock us into this sort of nonsense, right? This is a manufactured problem. The solutions are there. We can easily address this, right? But it is all about keeping us locked into these old and dying coal plants which have been run into the ground, but not allowing new energy to come on board so that we can force in corrupt projects. So maybe to bring it back to like this overthrowing ecological apartheid, right? So we're stuck, we have the most unequal, most polluting, well, almost the most polluting, and so depending on how you measure it, and one of the highest unemployment rates. So what we shouldn't be doing is just bringing in foreign direct investment to stoke that very same economic structure, right? Instead, how do we move away from that extractive structure to a new structure? One of the things we could be doing, instead of trying to invite loans from overseas to try invest in a privatized transition, is taxing the wealthy, is taxing the corporations that are extracting our wealth. And I mean, when you actually think about the wealth concentration in South Africa, let me just make sure I'm getting this right. 10% of the population owns 80% of the wealth, right? And so we need to be taxing that, and we could use that to invest in a localization of manufacturing of renewable energy, which would create millions of jobs. we could use that to invest in a different form of industrialization. So there's good studies that show that if you invest, instead of this heavy minerals energy complex industrialization, light industrialization, manufacturing, that can create many, many, many more jobs, right? The reason we don't do it is because we're beholden to the minerals energy complex predominantly, right? And of course, one of the big things that we need to do if we're going to invest in a just transition to renewable energy is, in order to generate energy, you need land, right? And so land reform is vital. And if we think about some of the highest potential for job creation, land reform is at the key of that. The concentration of land in the hands of a few is one of the biggest obstacles to job creation in South Africa. Now imagine you could couple land reform with socially owned renewable energy. Have you heard of something called agrovoltaics? Agrovoltaics is where you take solar and you place that in amongst your agriculture, right? And not only does that provide you with energy, but it also has benefits because it can help shade some of your crops, which is quite useful against the very harsh African sun, right? And so it can actually help boost yields. Now imagine you had a program of land reform that was coupled with socially owned renewable energy, and you funded that by taxing the hell out of the rich, and I think it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez over in the United States. She's a Democratic Socialist, and she says every billionaire, maybe even every millionaire, is a policy failure. So we need to tax them out of existence and instead build out that sort of revolution of agrivoltaics, land reform. And of course, in order to make that happen, we need a massive job creation and training program because there is a massive skill shortage. And while I'm thinking about the overseas international politics, one of the type of politics that they talk about is something called the Green New Deal, right? And this is where they combine social, ecological, economic, and racial justice together for a transformative program to overturn our economies. And they're starting to discuss that. The young activists over in the United States, young activists across various different parts of the world are talking about the climate crisis and the economic crisis together as an opportunity to really do transformative politics, because these crises are deeply intertwined, and they both call for us to make a massive transformation. So, I mean, in South Africa, it's obvious the social inequalities are clear. We need deep, deep transformation. But if you look at the climate science, it's also telling us very, very clearly that within the next few decades, we need to completely transform our societies. I haven't spoken too much about the climate crisis here, but I think we really need to dwell on that a bit. There's a study that showed that South Africa is up to 20% poorer as a result of climate change, right? It has made us more unequal. It is undermining our access to things like water, to food, to the basic. This is bread and butter issues. People often talk about the climate crisis as if it's about polar bears and remote things, but no, this is undermining our fundamental human rights. And I think here I want to turn to the former UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, a guy called Philip Alston. And he wrote this report about what he calls climate apartheid, right? And basically climate apartheid is about the fact that when it comes to climate change, the people who cause this problem are mostly rich, white Westerners. And in South Africa, it's the rich, wealthy elites that benefit from our coal-fired apartheid era structures that still very much exist, right? And they are the ones that can afford to shelter themselves from the impacts of climate change. They're the ones who have the wealth, the resources to be able to not be as heavily impacted by the floods, the droughts, and so on. Whereas the vast majority of the global population, the global poor, the global majority are the ones that least contribute to the problem, but are most devastated by it. So we're facing climate apartheid in the future. And in this report, he warns that the impacts of climate change, and I'll do a little bit of quoting here, are likely to undermine the basic rights to life, to water, to food, and housing for hundreds of millions of people. It could also undermine democracy and the rule of law. And so his report, which he sent to the UN Human Rights Council, concluded that if we do not take drastic action on climate change, then human rights might not survive the coming upheaval, right? And if you look at the science, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said that, we have the next 3 decades basically to transform our societies across energy, across transport, across housing, across urban infrastructure and industry, to get to a point of zero total emissions and when it comes to climate change. Otherwise, we're facing runaway climate change that will have those sort of devastating impacts that will reverse our progress on development, on poverty, and will create an unstable future. And that's terrifying, right? We are the generation that is stuck with that mess, right? But I think it also provides us with an opportunity. We have two incredibly urgent transformation imperatives. We have the transformation imperative of overthrowing the economic structures of apartheid, and we have the transformation imperative of overthrowing an ecologically destructive system which is fast sending us into ruin. And if we can bring those two ecos together in how we build our movements, in how we build our struggles, then I think we have the potential to build the movement that's actually strong enough to fight against that rapacious mining capital that's holding us back, right? And so I think to go to sort of a Fanonian point, right, is that the generational mission. Our generational mission is in some ways defined by the science of climate change. Because if we don't act now, there won't be climate justice in our lifetimes because it'll be too late, right? And so following on previous generations whose generational mission was to overthrow political apartheid, I think in a lot of ways ours is to overthrow the intertwined ecological and economic apartheid that sit together. And if we can do that, I think we can build a much more incredibly socially and ecologically just world, because there are so many opportunities in doing that, right? So it's not just about the negative, it's about building prosperous futures that deliver on millions of job opportunities. It is about building more socially, ecologically just cities. It's about delivering on public mass transit that helps to upend the structural legacies of segregation and the built divides that we create in our urban cities based on apartheid. Like, these are all such exciting opportunities for us to build a better world. And so as much as we are guided by the urgency and the crises and the injustice and the apartheid, I think we can also be guided by the possibilities of putting ourselves to work in building that better future. Because that is such an exciting opportunity, and there's so much work to be done. And so it's a crime that there are so many people unemployed, while there is so much work that we need to do to build a better world. Thanks, comrades.